it creates this mentality for individuals to see this. They're going to say, some of them are going to say, City of San Francisco says I'm owed $5 million. That's how oppressed I am. That's a fortune. That's a lot of people, never even get near that in their entire lifetime of earnings. It's a fortune. You're rich if you have $5 million. I'm so oppressed and so unjust. It's so unjust in America that they owe making me rich tomorrow and they won't even do it. That's a poisonous mentality. How much do you think a panel in San Francisco that was investigating what reparations level, monetary level, should be for each individual or for each household of black residents in San Francisco? How much money do you think the panel recommended? Just wondering. Just want you to think in your head. If you guessed $5 million, you get the prize. It was a $5 million one-time payment that this San Francisco panel studying reparations on behalf of the city of San Francisco. It was established by the San Francisco supervisors in 2021. There's also, by the way, a separate task force created by California's legislator to study reparations. And it should be noted that there's also in this study a demand that there is the complete elimination for all debts all debts that a black household may have. So credit card debt, mortgage debt, anything, any financial debt would be wiped away. I don't know if the task force means that then is just added to the tab, because that is money that's owed to somebody. This is always a part of just like cancel debt. Debt is owed to someone.
Yeah, what percent? I mean, when you hear $5 million, I mean, that is such an outlandish number, Buck. What percentage of Americans do you think have $5 million in assets?
In liquid assets? Less than 1/10 of 1%, maybe 1/100th of 1%, something like that.
So when you hear, and I think that's about right, when you hear that number, we used to, back in my full-time law practice days, we used to say one reason you want the least educated juror possible if you are a plaintiff's lawyer is because the lower the education level of a juror, the less likely they are to understand the value of money, right? Because you're just like, oh, we'll give them $5 million. We'll give them $10 million. And plaintiff's lawyers know this because there is no conception of the value of money. Because if you don't have very much money, and typically lower education jurors do not have that much money, the difference between $5 million and $500 million to them is like the difference between 5,000 and 50. It doesn't really compute. So when I hear these numbers, whatever you think about reparations, and I think they're crazy, and we've talked about why from a historical basis I think they're crazy, to come out with a number like 5 million for a house, for an individual, is so far outside the bounds of what even a wildly successful person in America of any race could have as assets today, that it's almost like they're trying to intentionally be as ridiculous as possible.
Here's a way to put it in context, that if they went forward with this proposal, the city of San Francisco has a budget of $14 billion. Based on the population, I believe it's about there are about 50,000 black residents in San Francisco. San Francisco is not a huge city by population. What is it?
It's also not that many black people who live in San Francisco.
It's not a heavily black city, and
it's usually
it's not a huge,
a lot of white. Yeah,
yeah. It's in the hundreds of thousands. It doesn't even break. I don't even think San Francisco breaks 1 million. It would cost. They have a $14 billion budget. This measure alone would cost $50 billion. So 4 years of its entire budget for everything, public schools, police, fire, sanitation, you name it. 4 years of that just for this, for 50,000 of the let's call it, I should look up the population. I think it's like 600,000. Does that sound about right for San Francisco?
Well, it depends on all these geographic areas, because so many people live right outside the larger. But this is just the San Francisco proper that they're talking about.
Right, this is San Francisco, the city of. This is not a county matter. Look, the point is, folks, it's completely insane. Okay, let's just say this is totally crazy. And I understand that people might jump to this is just meaningless virtue signaling. Well, first of all, it's paid for, but these are people that are paid to do this study by the city of San Francisco. I'm not saying it's a huge amount of money, but it's obviously in enormous ways. But it also creates a mentality here, and it sets a benchmark. And I think that's what it's meant to do. You know, when people, you talk about being a lawyer, Clay, or, time when you were a lawyer, when people sue for $10 million for defamation, they really want $1 million, 500,000, maybe 100,000, right? But they'll sue, or they'll sue for some crazy large number, but they're not really going to get that number. By saying it's 5 million, one, they get attention. Two, it makes it seem like other reparations committees, by comparison, are somewhat reasonable. If they say, only 250,000 per residence, what we're thinking. And then also, it creates this mentality for individuals to see this. They're going to say, some of them are going to say, City of San Francisco says, I'm owed $5 million. That's how oppressed I am. That's a fortune. That's a lot of people, never even get near that in their entire lifetime of earnings. It's a fortune. You're rich if you have $5 million. I'm so oppressed and so unjust. It's so unjust in America that they owe making me rich tomorrow, and they won't even do it. That's a poisonous mentality.
It is, and it's also about, to your point, if you say, 5 million, well, then somebody else comes back and they're like, well, we'll give you 500,000 instead. Then you feel like you're getting a deal. Right?
They call this anchoring in negotiation, where you set it far off, and then it's reasonable by comparison.
And so as you kind of break this down, these conversations that they are trying to create are being shepherded in many ways by white people who are woke and feel like they have to in some way atone for their whiteness. This is a real issue in the Democrat Party, that we have moved from, and this is significant too, Buck, because it all goes to expectations. We've gone from, when you and I were kids, being taught, hey, don't judge people by their race. Treat everybody equally, which is really the essence of the message of Martin Luther King, whose birthday holiday was yesterday. And that has rapidly evolved over really the last decade, I would say, from, hey, the goal is no longer treat everybody equally. The goal is we have to atone for what has occurred in our past. And I'll just point this out. Slavery existed everywhere, all over the world, for all of human civilization. Every single person that is listening to us right now has the blood of slaves running through your veins. At some point in time, you know this, Buck, as somebody who has studied history, I would venture that every single person who is listening to us right now, at some point, your ancestors were enslaved somewhere around the world. You have someone who was a slave, because the primary way that war was waged was, if you won, you took the women and the kids of your of the person that you had beaten, and often killed all the men and took their women and children as your slaves to increase your overall wealth. That was commonplace. We're focusing exclusively on the American African slave trade, which was only legal in America, it's worth pointing out, as America as a country for 80 years, right? 1783 to 1863. That's the only time slavery was legal in this country. Before that, it was Britain's responsibility. But we are treating that as if it is the only slavery that has ever existed anywhere in the world, uniquely as if this is an American stain and an American sin, when it went on around the world. And when, let's also put in perspective, the slaves were being sold by Africans right?
This is why we talked about the movie, the Warrior, a Woman King, right. Warrior King. I forget. I think it's the Woman King. The Woman
King or Woman
Warrior
King. Yeah,
about the Dahomey tribe of West Africa, which was a vicious tribe of slavers taking other black people as slaves. And they were the ones who were going deep into the interior of West Africa and murdering, anybody who stood in their way and taking as many captives as they could and selling them into slavery. But this is not something that often gets talked about.
Well, and if we were going to do true reparations for the African slave trade, you would have to say, and look, I think this is crazy. Let me just preface it by saying this. But if you were going to do it, you would assess a substantial cost to Great Britain, right? Because they were the colonies. They controlled the slave trade in the United States. When we were colonies, we were subject to the laws of Great Britain. And you would also assess reparations against the African countries that allowed slaves to be sold there. And then you would, it's all a huge mess.
But even taking this seriously as a looking at the historic, if I show up in Turkey and I say, you guys were engaged in a massive slave trade of Europeans for 300 years, about 200 plus years, I want to check. They would all laugh in my face, right? This is not ever going to happen. You are only morally responsible for what you do as a person. That is the fundamental moral value that the left tries to eradicate. I have no responsibility for what my ancestors, from Ireland, by the way, may have done 100 years ago, 1,000 years ago. Zero. I take no responsibility for it whatsoever. And people who play this game are just looking to dress up their own pursuit of power and their own redistributive Marxist nonsense in some kind of moral trappings. It's garbage.
And I agree. But also, how many people listening to us right now, I'm one, have white ancestors who fought in the Civil War to end slavery and died, right? Like, do I get paid because my great-great-great-great-grandfather died in the Civil War fighting for the Union for Kentucky? I don't think so, but he helped end slavery. Worth thinking about, where exactly does the moral connection end? Who gets paid? Who doesn't? All this is crazy. But I guess move to San Francisco if you're black. Buck, I'm still fired up about our discussion about $5 million in San Francisco to every black resident, which is just a crazy amount of money. And to your point earlier, the number of people that have $5 million in assets, period, in the United States of any race is a tiny, tiny pinprick of the overall United States population. But a couple of things about California in particular. California, I believe, became a state in 1850. It never allowed slavery. So the idea that San Francisco, as a part of a never slave state in California, would feel compelled to pay out any kind of reparations is woke madness. Also, as you build a larger sort of context here of what is being argued for, I don't think we can underrate what they are trying to do, which is set up artificially wild bar of $5 million. So at some point they negotiate that down. But how do you prove? And this is something that I think is goes to the essence of this idea. A huge percentage of black people that live in America today were not here when slavery actually occurred, right? And on top of that, even people who are here have smaller percentages of their lineage that might have been here during slavery, by which I mean there are constantly, if America was such an awful racist country, no one can ever answer this question. Why are so many people in Africa begging with every fiber of their being to be able to come to the United States? Why do Nigerian Americans out-earn white populations in the United States almost instantaneously when they arrive here? Because of the opportunity here.
I spent over 30 years as a New Yorker, Clay, and as there are a lot of West African immigrants to New York City, and the data speaks to a lot of small business ownership, a lot of upward mobility, a lot of living the American dream, which is you come here, you do well. And so how does that factor into all of these conversations? You know, how does the fact that, as you put it out, or as we've talked before, you know, Asian Americans have the highest per capita income. Indian American, you know, when you say Asian, one problem I have with the term Asian is that it's so big as to be essentially, you know, are you talking about somebody born in Nepal or somebody born in South Korea, right? I mean, it's too big to be really a useful term, but Asian Americans broken down by, you know, East Asia, South Asia, out-earn their white counterparts in America on a per household basis. So if that's a deeply racist system, it's a bizarre system. I mean, white supremacist racist system. It's a bizarre one because when you look at the outcomes are not actually racist the way that we are told they are. Not at all.
And also the other complicating factor here is, again, how would you assess it, right? So use someone like our former president, Barack Obama. He's half white. He's half black. But his dad was African. Came to this country long after slavery would have existed in this country. So would Barack Obama be entitled, if he lived in San Francisco, to reparations? Now, he's worth way more than $5 million. But, I mean, my point on this is it actually becomes supremely racist because you're going through somebody's genealogical history, their ancestry, and being like, well, you're this percentage descended from us. Like, how in the world do you figure all this stuff out? It's madness.
It's completely unworkable and falls into self-contradiction. But that's true of so many leftist programs and so many Democrat ideas. Really what it does is it creates a sense of hopelessness. It plays to a sense of people being malcontented with American society. It furthers divisions. It exacerbates resentments. All it does is tear down and destroy, ultimately, under the guise of doing justice, which is pretty much what Democrats do all the time.
No doubt. Also, wasn't affirmative action designed to be a payment in some way to reconcile for past slave injustice? So there actually has been a lot of money spent on this already.